Thank you. So again, the title is Teepees, Feathers, Buffalo, Beyond the Myths of Indigenous Identity. As Melissa mentioned, I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, and I'll mention that a lot throughout my talk, or especially at the end. But again, if you have any questions at any point, just let me know. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into a part that's going to ask you to participate. And so we were initially going to do breakout rooms, but now we're just going to have you you can either type this answer in the chat or you can unmute if you'd like. I'd prefer actually if you unmute. But the question is, and I always like to ask people to reflect on this, is what did you learn about Native Americans when you were in school? And so I'm thinking specifically about your pre-K all the way through 12th grade experiences. So would anybody like to share anything that you learned when you were in school about Indigenous peoples?
I don't mind sharing. This is Christopher Ratliff. I serve as the Dean of Student Success and Retention here at Aiken Technical College and come from the southeastern Ohio area. And in that area, you know, we were very fortunate to have a lot of Native American and Indigenous tribes originating from there, and, you know, Tecumseh. And so we had outdoor theater productions. So I was actually able to learn a lot about the Native American people and visit, you know, burial grounds and see performances in my pre-K experience. So I'm really, or pre-K through high school experience. So I'm very fortunate for that, from just because of the region that I lived in, I believe.
Right, right. Thank you for sharing that. I think we had a hand raised as well. Was it Sandy?
Yes, I believe Sandy McMahon had her hand raised. Do you want to unmute, Sandy?
She may need a few more moments. I'm not sure. Could we go to Athena now? Because I see you have your hand raised.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Hunt, Athena Freeman. I am the Director of Continuing Education. I actually grew up in your neighboring town of Laurinburg, North Carolina.
Awesome. Good.
Yeah. So being, you know, as close as we are between Lumberton and Laurinburg, of course, I grew up with Native Americans we were shoulder to shoulder all the time. And one of the most amazing things that really struck me was just how close Native Americans were with each other, their culture, and they stayed true to themselves. And that really struck me as really very awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Athena. Now, Sandy, were you able to unmute to discuss the question? We might have lost her. Well, anybody? I see Bruce, you have your hand up.
Hello there. You know, now it's been quite a while since I went through the public school system, but I know back in the 70s and 80s, basically, you know, you would discuss Native Americans up until the American Revolution, and then they pretty much disappeared until you had Western expansion. And then, you know, after about 1890, that was pretty much it for any discussion of Native American populations, at least in the public school system that I went through back in the 70s and 80s. I would hope that has changed over the years, but I'm not sure that it has, based on you know, the knowledge of some of the students that actually came into my classes here at ATC years ago. I used to be the history instructor here at the college.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And you bring up a really good point. There's actually a research study that was published in 2015, and the authors reviewed a bunch of textbooks that were popular across America. And what they found is that 87% of all content on Indigenous people occurs pre-1900s. And so kids are only learning about Native American people up into the 1900s. So typically after the Trail of Tears is when they're not learning anything else about Native people after that. And if you think about kind of the psychological or educational impacts of teaching about Native people, maybe about Thanksgiving or Columbus, and then the Trail of Tears, and then after that you teach nothing, then you're going to leave students with the impression that either Indigenous people don't exist anymore, or that if they do, they're kind of tucked away somewhere in America where nobody, they're not your neighbors, right? Like Athena was saying earlier about living in Laurinburg. So I think teaching from that perspective often ends up being really harmful, not only to Native students, but also to non-Native students as well, because it gives them the picture or the image in their mind that Indigenous people don't exist anymore. So thank you so much for sharing that. And that actually is a really good segue into my next point. So I saw on Twitter a few years ago, someone did this little kind of Google experiment, and they Googled the term 3 Black teenagers, and the pictures that came up were all mugshots. And they Googled the term 3 white teenagers, and the pictures that came up were like white teenagers playing volleyball or soccer or engaging in other kind of fun activities. And so I wanted to do a similar experiment and to Google the term Native Americans, as you can see that I Googled at the top, to see what kind of imagery comes up. Because I think sometimes we think about the internet or maybe Google especially as being an inherently non-biased entity, but it can still replicate some stereotypes that I think that people have, because people are the ones who are creating the internet. And so I want to ask you to look at this picture for a moment, and then you can either unmute. You don't have to raise your hand. You can either unmute or type in the chat just your first thoughts about these pictures.
Well, for me, the thing that strikes me first is that they all look older, you know, like historical images. No modern, yes, no modern images. I agree with Michaela.
Yes. So both of you saying that all the pictures are looking like they're from the past, they're all old, no modern. Any other thoughts?
Well, sadly, I think when people think of, or when Americans think of Native Americans, these are the kind of images that pop to mind. It doesn't pop to mind the, scholarly studies, modern Native American activities. Again, it goes back to these sort of historic or today sort of stereotyped images.
Right. So rooting Native people in a very limited kind of a box. So there's this really popular TED Talk that I like. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. And so viewing a group of people kind of only through one lens, or only allowing them to be one way or look one way. I think these pictures all kind of represent that. Let me see, there's somebody else in the chat that says that gives the impression that this group of people isn't something talked about enough, given the older images. Yes, I think that's a really good insight as well. And also, if you look, nobody is smiling in the picture except for two, it looks like 2 of the photos. So the top left and then the bottom right. And then also in another 2 of them, there's weapons. And so it also, I think, contributes to the stereotype of Indigenous people as violent. I think there's a common stereotype of like Indigenous people as savage, but also of Indigenous people as being very stoic and reserved and not displaying any emotions. For example, if you think about the movie, I think it's called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There's a Native actor in the movie who's very important in the book version, but in the movie he actually never speaks the entire time except for one specific scene, and so he's kind of seen as this very stoic figure. But thank you all for reflecting on these images. Someone else said they had to make their own way of life. Yeah, that's a good insight as well. But these images, again, all depict Indigenous people in a very limited way that's only situated in the past and doesn't really show Indigenous people as a part of the present. Even the picture in the bottom right looks like the most modern image, but it's still in black and white. So even with the modern image, they put it in the context of black and white to make it even appear older. And so these pictures are, again, the very common reference point that people think about when they think Indigenous people. So I wanted to show you a few more images of very popular movies about Indigenous people. So we have The Lone Ranger, Last of the Mohicans, Pocahontas, and then Dances with Wolves. And for the first two movies, the characters who are playing Indigenous characters in the movie are actually white men. So we have Johnny Depp, who's playing Tonto, and the word Tonto actually means stupid, and so he plays kind of this stupid Indian character in this very popular film, The Lone Ranger, which was also a popular TV show, I think, or could have been movie many years ago. And then Last of the Mohicans, we have Daniel Day-Lewis, who's playing an Indigenous person, but who, if you know who Daniel Day-Lewis is also a white man. And then Pocahontas tells the story of a Native woman in the Disney representation, but in actuality, around the time that these events were rumored to have occurred, she would have been 8 years old. And so it makes, in the Disney version, they make her appear to be in her maybe early 20s, when in reality she was still very much a child. And then we have Dances with Wolves. Even though there are Indigenous peoples in the movie, I think it's important to show that within the context of this movie, there's Kevin Costner, who plays the white savior role, and so he ends up actually saving the Indigenous people in the movie, which is a very popular trope in movies. If you think about the movie Avatar, it's a very similar kind of constructed movie where there's a white savior who comes in and saves the Indigenous peoples. And so these movies are, again, probably the most popular Indigenous movies that people know about when they think about indigeneity. And again, all framed from the context of the past, and all portraying Indigenous people in not the most positive light. And even if it is positive, very much not an accurate representation, which is the case of Pocahontas specifically. And then so in keeping in that same vein, some of you may remember this ad campaign from the 70s and 80s. It was from the Keep America Beautiful Corporation. And so the ad, if you remember, and if you do, just let me know in the chat, there was this Native man, as you can see in this picture. His name was Iron Eyes Cody. He was actually in more Native films than any actor in history. And so he's rowing in a canoe on the river, and then someone throws out a piece of trash, and then he cries. And so you can see like the lone tear that's going down his face. And it was supposed to represent, I guess, the ways that people believe that Indigenous peoples are connected to the land and hurt when people litter. But in actuality, Iron Eyes Cody, so the actor that you see in this picture, was actually from Italy. So he was not even an Indigenous person or American Indian. He was Sicilian. He had immigrated to America when he was younger, and then began pretending or dressing up to appear to be Indigenous, when in reality he actually was Italian. And I know Italian people did face a lot of persecution at one point in American history, but Indigenous people did too. So I'm not sure if he was trying to evade any kind of persecution, but I think that maybe he was fascinated with Indigenous culture, as we see a lot of non-natives are occasionally, but then he took it obviously to the extreme. Very similar story. This was a very popular book called The Education of Little Tree by a man named Forrest Carter. That was actually a false name, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it told the story of a young Cherokee boy as he was growing up and living with his Cherokee grandparents. And it was a very famous book. It ended up getting put on Oprah's book club list. And so it was a very, very popular book, even amongst Cherokee people as well. Soon after the book was published, however, and after kind of the hype, I think, began dying down, they actually learned that the true author of the book was a man named Asa Earl Carter, as you can see on the right side here. And Asa Earl Carter was actually a notorious member of the KKK. If you know who George Wallace is, I think he was the former governor of, I think it was Alabama, and he was very anti desegregation efforts that were happening in Alabama at the time. And he has a very famous speech where he says the term, he says segregation today, segregation now, segregation today, segregation forever. That became kind of a very popular, a very famous line. And actually Asa Earl Carter, so the man in the photo here, is rumored to have written that line for George Wallace. And so just like the image that I showed you before with a non-native person pretending to be native, we see Asa Earl Carter doing that as well. And even if you think back to the films, these are very much films that are not occurring from or being created out of an Indigenous lens or from an Indigenous perspective, but they're very much made by non-natives for non-natives to show what they think that Indigenous people should be like or act like or look like. And it's very similar with this story as well. And so it's not a far jump to get from those kinds of stories and kind of imagery of people pretending to be Native to get to the issue of Indigenous mascots. And so I have a few examples here. I think the one on the top might be from a high school, but I'm not sure. But then you can see the one on the right with the man in the red face. And then there's a political cartoon on the bottom left that says, "But I'm honoring you, dude." And it's a person dressed up like a Native mascot speaking to an actual Indigenous person. And so if you kind of follow the sequence of the slides that I presented, it's a very captivating part or a critical part of American culture, I think, for people to play Indian or dress up like Indians, either for sports or for clubs or for different organizations. Actually, the YMCA has a group that they've changed the name now, but there's still the same messaging behind it. They have a group called the Youth Guides now that used to be called the Indian Guides. But in the Indian Guides, you would get assigned a tribe, and then you would get an Indian name, and then there would be all these kind of rites of passage that were very much pretending or playing to be Indian. And so we see this really, again, common part or common component of American culture that involves this kind of ideology of playing Indian or identifying with having a great-great-grandmother who's Cherokee. We also hear that as being really common as well. And I think we have a hand raised, Athena.
Yes, I wanted to mention when I was probably a teenager and, growing up in North Carolina, we visited Cherokee a lot up in the mountains, and we saw plays or dramatizations of onto these hills and that kind of thing. Outside, outdoors, into in the mountains, and all of the characters that played Indians were white males or white women. We saw no Native Americans that actually played in those roles. So that I'm saying that to support you too in what you're saying about others that are portraying Native Americans.
Right. So it's a very, very common thing, and I actually didn't know that that happened in that production. I haven't seen it. I've only heard of it, but that's a very common part of our collective culture of being Americans in general. Even when you think about Halloween, dressing up like an Indian for Halloween. When you think about Thanksgiving, when people celebrate Thanksgiving in schools, they'll have the kids dressed up like pilgrims and Indians, and so it becomes a very popular trope. And I think a lot of people don't think it's problematic, but if you think all of these images are showing a very specific type of Indigenous person. So they're all typically wearing feathers. They have the face paint on. They're wearing buckskin. And so when an actual Indigenous person comes into your space, I encountered this a lot in college. People don't know what to do with you because you don't look like what they imagine an Indigenous person is supposed to be like. So when I went away to college, people would ask me things. They would ask me, when I told them I was Native, they would say, "Well, do you live in a teepee?" Somebody asked me if I had running water. Other people were surprised that I was wearing shoes. I remember a student, I was actually presenting to students at a elementary school once, and a student asked me, had I ridden a horse to get to her school? And so a lot of people have this very stagnant and kind of static view of Indigenous people that doesn't actually allow for the authenticity, the complexity, and the modernity of Indigenous people to permeate in their minds. And so there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that goes on when you meet an actual Indigenous person, but then again, we don't look like any of these images that I've showed you. And so for me, even being a Southern person, so being from the South and having a distinct Southern accent, that was a lot stronger, especially when I first got to college. I remember a girl told me that she thought that I would sound more mystical since I was Native, and that she didn't think that Native people could be Southern. There's this very beautiful line in a New York Times article that was written by a Lumbee historian. Her name's Melinda Maynor Lowry, and she says that Lumbee people and Indigenous people specifically are the original Southerners, and we were here before something called the South ever existed. And so I love that line so much, and I think that a lot of times, again, when people think about Indigenous people, they think of us being out west, or in Oklahoma, but definitely not in North Carolina or South Carolina, even though there are many, many, many tribes in both states and all throughout the South as well. So that's another thing to think about. And so I see somebody else said, is the concept of red face the same as the concept of blackface? I don't think it's the same. I don't think you can ever make a one for one. However, I do think it is still very, very offensive. There's never a time when I've seen anyone dress up like this and I thought that it was appropriate. So it's very offensive and it definitely should not be done. And I'm really glad that now there's a more concerted effort to get rid of Indigenous mascots, because again, they replicate images of Native people that don't exist anymore, or that possibly never existed. And also there was a research study that was published a few years ago that showed that these images are actually harmful to Native kids, because they are living in their Native communities and they're living around Native people. And then they're seeing on TV, this is what people think natives are. And so they encounter a lot of kind of psychological trauma and turmoil in trying to reconcile the two. There was also another study that showed that this kind of dressing up ends up harming non-natives as well, because they will perceive Native people, when they meet a Native person, they'll perceive them to be more violent than they would a non-Native person. So that ends up causing a lot of turmoil, I think, for non-natives and for natives as well. But thank you for that comment. And so to go from this kind of image to this one is also not a big leap. So there was a high school, I think it was about 5 to 7 years ago, but their mascot was the Indians. And so the opposing team during a game wrote this sign that said, "Hey Indians, get ready for a Trail of Tears Part 2." And so you can see how something like this is not only extremely inappropriate and just strange, I would say, but harmful. And it's one of the harmful effects of having Indigenous mascots, because people become empowered to use very real and traumatic parts of history as kind of a cute thing to do during a homecoming game, which is not obviously going to be well received by Indigenous people. And I think the school system here, they issued a formal apology, but at this point the damage has already been done. And we see a lot of signs like this and a lot of kind of comments like this from opposing teams whenever another team has an Indigenous mascot. And so also thinking about not only mascots, but again, a propensity of dressing up like Indians again, which I talked about as being kind of a common part of American culture. I don't know if you all saw this, but this went viral on Twitter about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I believe she's a math teacher. So if you remember in geometry class, I think it was in geometry, but it could have been calculus, you learned the term Sakatoa, and I'll type it in the chat. And it's a concept, again, I think geometry, but it's like sine, cosine, and tangent. So that's where the S, the C, and the T come from. And so she's trying to teach this concept of Sakatoa because the letters all mean something. And I remember when I was in school, my teacher actually told us to remember it and pretend that it's a Native American name. So apparently this is a common thing, but my teacher didn't dress up and do this. But what this teacher did is she chanted Sakatoa over and over and over again while wearing this fake headdress that she had made, and then kind of jumping around. And then she ends up jumping on top of the desk. She does some kind of war whooping noise, and a lot of the students are laughing, but then there was also an Indigenous student in the class who was filming her, and then that's how it ended up going viral. And so we see that this concept of dressing like an Indigenous person is not just relegated to a football field or a basketball stadium, or even a history class, or maybe even a Thanksgiving lesson that a teacher might be given, but it's also in math classes as well. And so this obviously made the Native student very uncomfortable because his teacher is behaving in a way that she thinks Indigenous people act, when in reality, this is not what Native people do in general, but this is her perception, and this is how she's teaching this mathematical concept to her students. And so I want to just identify a few themes of what I see from these images is that what is Native becomes what is not, and what is not Native becomes what is. And so what people think about what Native people should look like, or sound like, or what they should wear, or how they should travel, or what they should live in, becomes kind of rooted in these kind of movies that I showed you and these kind of images that I showed you as well. And then what is native, me with freckles and hazel eyes and curly hair, becomes what is not. And so we see this really significant media distortion of indigeneity that kind of is fitting within what America thinks Native people should look like or be like, or even if we should exist at all, which you see in a lot of the movie representations, again, which are showing us only as being a people of the past and never a people of the present. And so again, I think these are some really common themes as well. There's another component of this that you may all have heard of before, where there's this new phenomenon of people using the term tribe to refer to their group, or I've even heard bridesmaids before, or like a bride call her bridesmaids her bride tribe. And so taking a term that's historically been rooted with Indigenous people and then just using it to mean a friend group. There's also another common thing that people do where they'll say they're native to an area when they really mean that they're from there or that they were born there. So they'll say, and for me as a Native person, it's always really confusing when someone says, yeah, I'm a Charlotte native or something like that, when they mean that they're from Charlotte. And so even using the term native is becoming something that's not even just associated with native anymore. There's also another common thing of taking native names and putting it on stuff that's not native. So if you think about the Pontiac, the car, that the Pontiac are a tribe, but now it's a car. And then the Jeep Grand Cherokee is a Jeep, but it's actually a tribe. And so taking native names and putting it on stuff that's not native. So that becomes that's a really, I think, popular thing as well. There's even a big part of American war culture where planes, I think, and helicopters were named after Indigenous peoples or Indigenous tribes. And so there's just this very common trope of kind of taking native names and assigning it to things that have nothing to do at all with Native people. I see another comment that says mainstream media, movie productions, and lack of teaching in schools is so damaging. And yes, that's so totally correct. So I wanted to show you some examples from a textbook, more specifically. So this image is from a textbook in Canada, and I think oftentimes in America, people often romanticize Canada, and we think that Canada is just the ultimate in being a perfect nation and doing all. Sorry, that's my doorbell. My perfect nation, doing perfect things. But in reality, they have been, I would say, probably even more harmful to Indigenous peoples than even America has been. And so this is a part of a Canadian textbook, and I'll read it to you. It says, when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations peoples agreed to move to different areas to make room for new settlements. And I want to see if I can get maybe one or two people to unmute and tell me just your thoughts in general about this text.
I can't use the words that I want to use, but laughable is the nice version of what I want to say.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would second that, and I would say that the term agreed is definitely incorrect.
Yes, definitely incorrect. Deanna? You can unmute, Deanna. Okay, we can go to Athena.
That's very sad, and that's not true. And it's almost like the statement, Columbus discovered America.
Right. Very good insight. And also, if you think about this textbook, again, I mentioned is for elementary school, which you can clearly see from the kind of cartoon images in the corner, but teaching this to young kids is especially harmful because the younger the child is, the more impressionable they're going to be. And also, if you teach a child this at a young age, it's going to become even more difficult as they get older to kind of uproot or get rid of this kind of thinking. And so it becomes really problematic, especially to teach this to kids. But I think there is a really common unfortunate propensity in America and clearly in Canada as well of sanitizing or cleaning up kind of American history and making it look a little bit cleaner or a little bit neater than it really was, because we know that Indigenous people did not just agree to leave the land that they had inhabited for thousands of years, right? That's the issue is much more bloody and evil than that. So, and also, yes, this was recent. So I think too about, there was a Texas textbook a few years ago. There was a really big controversy. I think it ended up getting resolved, but they referred to enslaved peoples as migrant workers, and they said that they immigrated to America to work on plantations. And so this is not just a Canadian issue. This is definitely an American issue, again, of cleaning up parts of our history that are there's no possibility of cleaning them up, right? But we see the ways that textbook authors will try to make American history and Canadian history seem a lot cleaner and neater than it really was. Let me just look at the chat really quickly. Whitewashing history. So yes, that's exactly what this is. Deanna?
You hear me this time?
Yes.
Are you able, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I teach history here, I'm an archaeologist from out in the West. I worked with the Paiute and Shoshone mostly. And one of the things that I find with the history books is oftentimes they'll take something like the Proclamation of 1763, where Native Americans did agree to treaties that, you know, they wouldn't have white settlers expanding past the Appalachians, or, you know, the infamous incident with the Lenni Lenape, you know, that they agreed to something that they were taken advantage of. But we also see it, you know, one of the other attendees mentioned the whitewashing, you know, especially, you know, we have one of the most infamous schools out there that we were working on, the Stewart School out in Nevada. And it's comparable to the schools in Canada, which are now being uncovered, and we're finding out the degree to which assimilation was forced. And so it's really important, you know, for instructors of history. For example, my students will read from Gertrude Bonin, who was Zitkalasa. They will read her autobiography, a portion of it at least, to understand that the mainstream Marxist textbooks that we're teaching from, they do leave out that second perspective, and it's really important to incorporate that if we're going to get a comprehensive view of critical thinking when it comes to Indigenous history.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's also a really critical piece, is having students read texts that are written by Indigenous people to get an Indigenous perspective. But also, I think it's important to point out that this perspective here would not have been the perspective of the European settlers either. They knew that Indigenous people didn't agree to move. So in reality, what's being taught in school is not really the truth of either perspective. It's just something that makes it appear, again, cleaned up, like I mentioned. But yes, I totally love that you're having your students read about Zitkalasa. I think that's awesome.
I would actually argue, Dr. Hunt, I would argue that perhaps like some of the historians and instructors themselves actually believe what they're writing here, you know, that they aren't digging deeper into it.
Right. I totally think that. And I think that most Americans believe in this perspective, or at least about half of Americans believe in this perspective. But most of the time it's because that's what they were taught when they were in schools. And so it's really hard to kind of uproot things that you were taught, especially by people that you trust, like teachers or maybe even parents, or by watching films that kind of help to contribute to this kind of narrative as well. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So I also want to think about kind of moving beyond these mythologies. So I talked to you a lot about different myths of indigeneity, different images that kind of construct this very limited view of indigeneity that a lot of Americans have, unfortunately. And now I want to move to reimagining and kind of deconstructing some of those stereotypes. And so just for a few to mention right now, casinos, for example, I think a lot of Americans think that native tribes have casinos. So most tribes don't have casinos. There's only one tribe in North Carolina, for example, that has a casino, and I don't think there are any in South Carolina. So in North Carolina, there are 8 state recognized tribes and only 1 has a casino, and that's the Eastern Band Cherokee. So for scholarships, there was also this common myth when I was in college that people thought I was going for free, but there are actually only about 350 total Native American-based scholarships, but there are 152,600 Native students currently enrolled in college, and so there's not enough scholarships. There's not even that's not even covering 1% of the students who would need scholarships, right? Reservations, so 80% of natives live in urban areas. Only about 20% of natives live on reservations. For tribes, I've heard people who believe that there are only like a few tribes left, but there are actually more than 600 tribes in the U.S. and also more than 5 million indigenous people. I know that in North Carolina, there's 100,000 indigenous people that live in the state. I'm not sure about South Carolina again, but I'm sure the numbers are probably pretty comparable. And then taxes, there's also another common misconception that Native people don't pay taxes. I've heard this many times. That is a stereotype we wish was true. I wish I did not have to pay taxes, but unfortunately my check reflects a big chunk of my money going to taxes. And also, just I mentioned this earlier, I think, but phenotypes, we have an array of phenotypes just like any other group. So even within my own family, I have a lot of people who are very brown skinned. What my cousin has straight black hair, but I have light skin and freckles and curly hair. There are some Native people with red hair. There are some Native people with very coarse hair and black hair or straight hair or blonde hair. And so Native people look very differently from each other, just like any other group has a lot of kind of genetic or phenotypical diversity. And also, again, just to rehash this point, Native people are not just from the West. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of indigenous people living in the South. Also, Native people are co-creators of Southern culture. So, for example, if anybody in the chat or anybody listening right now likes grits, Cherokee people are pretty much the creators of grits and also cornbread. And so a lot of foods that people think about as being Southern foods are actually very much indigenous foods. And so I wanted to show you these images. So when I went away to college at Duke, I had a lot of people saying some very, very, very strange, oh yes, grits with no sugar. That's right. We do not put sugar in our grits. That would be an abomination to my grandmother's. But when I went away to Duke, I had a lot of people say very strange comments to me about meeting indigenous that I mentioned earlier. And I didn't really have good comebacks to say to them. And so I wanted to create a space for Native kids who are preparing to go to college to kind of write down a microaggression that they faced or that they think they might face, and then also write a rebuttal down. And so I led this workshop through the North Carolina Native American Youth Organization a few years ago before COVID, and I had them do this kind of photo project with me. And so they wrote down the microaggression, and then I took a picture of their rebuttal. And so her comment was, people would say to her, "Indians still exist," and she wrote, "Obviously." This other student wrote, "You don't really look Native," and she said, "Well, not all Natives look the same. Our looks evolved over time, but our traditions stay the same." And so again, I just wanted to create a space for students to kind of reimagine or begin, again, planning for the inevitable of what it would be like to be in a space where there are not a lot of other Natives around them. And so I want to end today with telling you a few stories of Lumbee people specifically. And I know we're running low on time, and I want to have time for questions at the end. But I want to tell you 2 quick stories of Lumbee resilience and brilliance and strength. And so the first is this story of January 18th. I believe it was 1958, and it was the Battle of Hayes Pond. And so what happened was there was a Lumbee woman who was in a relationship with a white man, and the KKK, so the Klan, they found out about this relationship, this interracial relationship. And so they created this flyer, and they planned to have a rally in Robeson County, North Carolina, which is where most Lumbees live. There's about 50,000 Lumbees that live in the county. And they plan to have a Klan rally and a cross burning at Hayes Pond, which is in Maxton, North Carolina, which is right in the heart of Robeson County. And so they gathered about 50 Klans members, and they brought their wives with them as well. But what they did not know is that Lumbee people were also planning to send a group out there to kind of be the anti-Klan rally to this gathering. And so 500 Lumbee men and women, and also some Black community members as well, ended up surrounding the Klan at Hayes Pond. A Lumbee man shot out the light that was over the top of the field, and so everything went pitch black, and the Klan's members got really scared and they began to flee. Some Lumbee men were kept shooting up into the air. There was even Lumbee women who were there who were pregnant. There ended up being no casualties, but the Klan's members were trying to flee so fast that they ended up leaving their cars in ditches with their wives inside. So they abandoned their wives, and some of the Lumbee men actually had to help get the wives out of the ditches, which I think is the perfect ending to the story, to really show their cowardice that they would leave their wives there. They ended up capturing, the Lumbee men ended up capturing the Klan's KKK flag, and they wrapped themselves in it, and that became the cover of Life magazine within the next few days. So it became a national story of this group of Lumbee men and women, and also again Black community members who ended up running the Klan out of the county. And so it's a really, really powerful story of, again, Indigenous resilience and resistance to those forces. And so for the next story that I want to tell you is the story of Julian Pierce. And Melissa mentioned earlier my podcast. So the name of my podcast is The Red Justice Project. And if you're interested in listening to true crime stories, we tell a lot of Indigenous true crime stories. And this is one that we tell on episodes 6 and 7. So much that went into this that we had to do 2 different episodes. So Julian Pierce was a Lumbee attorney who was living in the county in the late 80s. During this time, there were a lot of murders of Native and Black men in the county. There was a case of a Lumbee man who was waving a bucket at a police officer and then was shot. There was also allegations that the police officer and that Lumbee man were both selling drugs together, and that the Lumbee man was going to turn him in. And there were, again, just a lot of murders in general happening at the time, and also allegations that the sheriff's department was selling drugs right out of the courthouse. And so Julian Pierce wanted to run for Superior Court judge in order to become judge in the county, to begin kind of the process of uprooting some of the police and also legislative corruption that was happening in the area. So about 6 weeks before the election, this would have been in February of 1988, Julian Pierce was found murdered in his home. There were a lot of rumors as to what happened. The sheriff had actually been asking him to step down and to not run for the judgeship. And the man who he was running against, his name was actually Joe Freeman Britt, and he's listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the deadliest prosecutor of all time, because he had more death row convictions than any prosecutor at that time. And so it's a very interesting story, very interesting place. And the election ended up taking place 6 weeks later, despite Julian being murdered. And Julian won the election by more than 1,000 votes. And so it showed you that the people of Robeson County would prefer to vote for this amazing Indigenous activist over kind of keeping the status quo in the county of murders and of kind of vigilantism. But another interesting, compelling component of this story is that Michael Jordan's father ended up being murdered in the county just a few years after this, and a lot of people alleged kind of police involvement and like drug issues and involvement with that murder. So a lot of people believe that Julian Pierce's story is very much linked to James Jordan, which is Michael Jordan's father. So he was murdered in Robeson County, North Carolina in 1992, I believe. And there's also a documentary on that called Moment of Truth if you want to learn more about it. It's on IMDb TV. So I just wanted to tell y'all these stories really quickly, just some stories of Lumbee people, and I think even when I reflect, for example, on what I learned about Indigenous people when I was in school, I never learned about Julian Pierce, even though Julian Pierce, this got recognition all the way from California to New York for what was happening during this time in Robeson County. And there's a Wikipedia article. There's been all kinds of think pieces on this in different really influential magazines and newspapers. But when I was in school, I didn't learn one thing about Julian Pierce, and I also didn't learn about the Battle of Hayes Pond. And so I think there are all kinds of stories like this of Indigenous people that demand to be told and to be heard, that unfortunately that are not talked about in our school systems at all. And so that's why I wanted to share these with you today. And again, if you want to learn more, I've told you ways that you can learn more about these specific stories. But if you're looking to just consume more Indigenous content in general, for some examples for TV shows, Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls are both really, really good shows for you to watch. They show Native people from a modern context, kind of free of any of the stereotypes that a lot of the other films that I showed you earlier have. And also for books, The Firekeeper's Daughter is a really popular book right now. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's getting made into a Netflix show next year by the Obamas. And it's a really fantastic book, probably my favorite book that I read this past year. And if you want to learn more about Lumbee people specifically, there's the book Lumbee Indians and American Culture by Melinda Maynor Lowry. And then now I want to open it up. I think we have about 5 minutes left just for any questions that y'all might have. But also here's my email as well. So yeah, does anybody have any questions?
Hi, this is Athena. I put in the chat boarding schools. I was just made aware of that within the last month, which I thought was an absolute horrible experience in America. So I wanted to put that out there to the folks that are here on this this particular presentation to really Google that, because you probably are not aware of it, that happened here in the United States of America.
Yes, thank you so much for mentioning that. So just for quick lesson, what the settlers and colonizers realized pretty quickly was that Native children and Native families have a very strong bond, and also Native children are the future of tribes. And so if you can separate Native people from their future, then you can more easily take their land. And so what happened when a child turned 3 or 4 years old is they were sent away, and not all Natives, but I would say especially most out west, they would be sent away to a Native boarding school that could be hundreds of miles away from their reservation or their tribal territory. And in these schools, they often weren't really learning anything, but they were forbidden from speaking their native language. And if they did, they would be beaten and sometimes had their fingers cut off. I don't want to get into too many gruesome details, but there was a lot of physical abuse as well as sexual abuse in the schools. And oftentimes they would build they would build a burial ground or have like a burial area before they would even build the school, because they knew that so many kids were going to die based on what they were going to do to them. And that's why so many bodies were found last year in Canada, or earlier this year. I believe, yeah, earlier this year in Canada, there's more than 5,000 bodies that have been found at the schools. And the last boarding school in Canada closed in 1997, and the last school in America closed in 1981. And so it's not like I'm just telling you a story from the 1800s. This is very much a part of modern history as well. So they opened in the 1800s and didn't close until the late kind of 1900s or so. Yes, thank you, Bruce, for including that link. Any other questions or comments?
I just have a comment. I just want to thank you, first of all, for the work that you're doing. It's so needed. And one of the things that this talk has made me realize today is that, as I mentioned earlier on, growing up where I did and having the opportunity to learn and to see and to witness was a lot of what you're saying. There's a lot of that historical image of the Native American people. And kind of to piggyback off what Bruce was saying also is that that history kind of stops. But what I'm curious about is what I'm also seeing in some areas, whereas the education of the Native Americans that are being now continued, of the modernization, the modern perception per se, it's very negative still. It's very much kind of what you were mentioning about, it's reservations, it's poverty, it's drug abuse, it's alcoholism. And so just, thank you again for your work, and I hope that you continue. And I think we all have that responsibility to just show that that modern perception is so needed, but it also needs to be correct, because not everyone's on a reservation living in poverty, even though that is plaguing the Native American culture. So just again, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really good insight to make. Actually forgot to mention that, but there is a lot of anytime Native people are often talked about in the classroom or in the media, it's always from a perspective of, again, poverty or trauma or some depressing, horrible story of murder, for example. And so we are much more than just trauma or genocide. We're also a people of great strength and resilience and humor and fun and joy and all these other emotions, just like any other group of people. And so presenting us from both perspectives. So not negating the trauma or the genocide, but also not negating the joy and the resilience and the strength. I think both are really important to telling a more nuanced and accurate story of Indigenous peoples.
I think when we were talking the other day, I had to stop myself from asking the question because I think the more you know, the more responsible you should be for that knowledge, and you should act in a responsible way. And so, with my increased awareness, because I've been on this journey for a while, and still surprised by the parts of our history that are just so hidden and kept from us. But the more that I learn, I grapple with, and we do have, coming from Georgia, I live in Georgia. Braves just won the pennant, and so I want to celebrate. But I remember a moment I'm watching the game, and of course the tomahawk chop starts and the music starts, and feeling torn because you want to celebrate. You get caught up in the moment of rallying for the team, but then there was this part of me that just kind of almost immediately got sad or embarrassed that I wanted to participate in that. How do we balance our increased awareness with the cultural parts of us that still make us us, if that kind of makes sense?
That's really hard, but I think that that's a common thing that a lot of people are going through right now. Even when I think back about the movie Pocahontas, for example, I watched that as a kid. I loved that movie as a child. I would like pretend to be Pocahontas as a kid, and but then the older you get and the more you know about her true story makes it impossible for me to celebrate that film and even films like that. Even thinking about there's so many other parts of our culture that are so similar when we think about like R. Kelly, or even when I think about the author of The Wizard of Oz. Unfortunately, I found out a few months ago that he wrote that Native American people need to be exterminated, and he believed in the full extermination of Indigenous people in order for white people to truly take hold of the land. And so learning that, but then liking the movie and the book puts me in, I wouldn't say a difficult position because I know what I should do. I know I shouldn't watch the movie anymore, but it still puts us in a position between things that we love or are passionate about, but also things that we know that are just wrong and that we should not support. And so I think that the more we know, the more it'll make it difficult for us to support things that we know are harmful to people who are already marginalized.
Are there any more questions? I mean, I know I could sit here all day and just listen to Dr. Hunt. Just from following you on social media, and again, I ordered the Firekeeper's Daughter, but I realized that it could be a heavy read too, and so having to balance that with again trying to navigate the realities a lot of us are facing and trying to balance today and deal with. I'll choose my time to sit with the book, and I want to read it in before though the production comes out. So thank you so much for personally raising my awareness in so many ways, for visiting with us today. And if we don't have any more questions and you don't have any more sayings, I will yield the floor to you for final comments, and just want to say again, thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Yep. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you all so much for your insightful comments and questions and for participating fully. I really appreciate it, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you all.